She is 25 years old, curled into the back corner of a dark bedroom closet, pressing the phone against her mouth so the man in the house doesn't hear her breathe. On the line, a 911 dispatcher asks her to repeat what happened. Angela Kramer can't say it any louder than a whisper, because on the other side of her bedroom door, somewhere in the house she grew up in, someone is still moving.
911. I'm in the house. They're shooting. They're shooting. Who is shooting? Oh, how many times did you hear shooting? 10 times. 10 times. Do you know where it's coming from? In the house? Yes. I need help. Okay, the officer got away. Just stay where you're at, okay?
She doesn't know yet what's happened downstairs. She doesn't know that her brother is folded behind a pool table in the basement, listening to the same silence she is, waiting for it to mean something. She only knows that in the last 90 seconds, the safest place she has ever known has become the most frightening place on earth, and that whoever is in this house with her is close enough to hear her if she lets herself make a sound. Anthony, 29, was staying in the basement while he figured out his next chapter. Michael, 20, had given up his bed for his girlfriend, who was staying the night, and was asleep on the living room couch instead. Angela was upstairs in her own room, back under her parents' roof after finally ending a relationship that had stopped feeling safe long before she admitted it to anyone. Jeffrey and Lori were down the hall, 30 years married, 3 kids raised. It's a Monday night in an unremarkable house in an unremarkable town, and it stays that way right up until the moment it doesn't. Just after 3 in the morning, the first sound isn't alarming on its own. It's glass, a single sharp break, followed by the dull, heavy impact of something forcing its way through wood and frame. Michael's girlfriend wakes first. For half a second, caught between sleep and waking, the sound doesn't register as anything at all. Then she opens her eyes to a shape climbing through the broken window, dressed head to toe in black, and every part of her understands, all at once, that this is real. She doesn't scream. There isn't time to scream. She's moving before she's even fully awake, and behind her she hears Michael's voice, confused, half asleep, asking what's happening, and then everything changes in an instant. Michael is up off the couch moving toward the kitchen, and for one brief, terrible moment, he is still ahead of what's coming, still capable of surviving this. He doesn't make it far. Upstairs, Jeffrey and Lori wake to the sound of their son in danger, and they do the thing that makes no sense, and every sense at once, they go toward it, toward their son's name, toward the only thing that matters to either of them in that moment, and it costs them everything. What happens at the base of those stairs will never be fully known by anyone who wasn't there, but by the time it's over, neither of them will get the chance to grow old in the house they raised their family in. What's clear from the scene investigators walk into afterward is that this wasn't chaos. It wasn't the panic of someone caught in the middle of a burglary. It was controlled, and it was deliberate, and it was carried out by someone who had been told, specifically, not to leave anything to chance. In under 5 minutes, the house that raised 3 children and held 30 years of a marriage has become the site of an unimaginable loss. And 2 people inside it are still alive, with no idea whether they'll see the sun come up. Angela stays in the closet, counting the sounds because counting is the only control left to her, though by now they've blurred into something she can no longer separate into individual moments. She hears footsteps afterward. Not fast, slow, deliberate, checking. She doesn't know what for. She only knows the footsteps are looking for her. Downstairs, Anthony has heard all of it with no context and no way to help. The crash, a heavy sound, his brother's voice cut short, then a string of noise he can't bring himself to fully process. He pulls himself behind the pool table and stays there, absolutely still, waiting for a silence that never quite convinces him it's safe. Upstairs, the search moves room to room, and at some point, bad luck for the intruder, impossible luck for her, it passes 2 places it never should have skipped: a bedroom closet door that never opens, a basement that never gets checked at all. 1 closed door and 1 set of stairs never descended are already the Difference between a family that loses 3 people and a family that loses everyone. When police arrive, the first thing they notice is what's missing. Nothing has been taken. No drawers pulled open. No jewelry boxes emptied. No sign anyone came looking for cash or valuables. Just a house otherwise undisturbed, as if whoever did this walked in already knowing exactly what he came for, and it wasn't anything that could be carried out in a bag. When detectives sit down with the survivors that morning, it doesn't take long to hear a name. Angela gives it to them almost without hesitation. Her ex, the father of her young son, a man she'd only recently found the strength to leave. She tells them how it started small and never stayed small. About the afternoon, he stood in the driveway arguing over a car her father had given her, and when Jeffrey wouldn't back down, things got physical, and he made a direct, unmistakable threat against her father's life. Police came that day too. No charges were filed. About a party thrown for her son's 3-month birthday, hosted by her own grandmother, when he saw Lori holding the baby and something in him snapped, he took the baby from her in a way that left both women hurt and walked out the door with a child that wasn't only his to take. And about 6 weeks before the murders, when her mother had grown frightened enough of him that she emailed her own employer's security office, attached his photograph, and asked that he not be allowed past the front desk because she had started to believe he might come find her at work. She tells them about the night before Thanksgiving, months before the murders, when Michael found out that a friend of his had been quietly buying drugs from her ex and lying about it to his face. Michael got on the phone himself that night, furious, and the 2 men exchanged threats neither one backed down from. Her ex showed up at her door near dawn afterward, still worked up, saying things that made it clear how far he was willing to go if it came to it. Nothing happened that night, but something in the family's sense of safety never fully came back afterward. She tells them about Christmas, just over 2 months before the murders, when he wouldn't let her bring their son to her parents' house for the holiday, and when she pushed back, he told her she would see her family again in the worst way imaginable. At the time, it sounded like the kind of thing an angry man says and doesn't mean. Nobody in the family repeated it out loud again until the morning 3 of them were actually gone. She tells them how controlling he'd become, how isolating her from her own family had stopped feeling like jealousy and started feeling like a campaign with a purpose behind it. And she tells them that on the night of the murders, he had custody of their 13-month-old son, Nicholas, which meant he had a reason, a real and legal one, to want her family out of the picture entirely. For the first hour, it feels like the entire case. Then detectives ask where he was that night, expecting the kind of vague alibi guilty men usually offer. Instead, they get the opposite. A casino. Not vaguely, specifically, on camera, in a building with hundreds of lenses covering every angle of the floor. The footage places him there, time stamped, moving through the casino at multiple points across the exact window when the tragedy was unfolding 45 minutes away. There's no gap large enough for him to have made the drive, been involved, and returned unnoticed. And there's a detail Angela mentions almost in passing, something from years earlier that suddenly means something it never used to. At that same casino, long before any of this, he'd once looked up at a security camera and told her he needed to be seen on tape because he had people out there doing things for him. She'd shrugged it off at the time. It was the kind of strange, half-boastful thing young men say to sound more important than they are. Now, sitting across from detectives, she hears herself repeat it back and understands, for the first time, that it wasn't boastful at all. It was rehearsal. Motive without opportunity. A theory that explains the why and fails completely to explain the how. And, under Illinois law, the contradiction comes with a clock attached, 72 hours to charge him or let him go. Every hour that passes is an hour closer to losing the only person who's ever made sense as the reason any of this happened. So they hold him on nothing but suspicion, and someone makes the one move that keeps the case alive. They take his phone. Buried in the call log is a string of calls from a number that traces to nothing. No name. No carrier registration. A phone that, on paper, doesn't exist, and it had been calling him, repeatedly, in the hours right after the murders. Investigators pull the voicemail attached to that number and listen more than once. The voice is young, male, frightened in a way that doesn't sound performed. He says he thinks he's being followed. He says he doesn't know what to do. And near the end, almost as an afterthought, he says a name. His own. Jake. It isn't much, but it's the first thread that leads anywhere, and they pull it the way you pull the only thread you have. Nothing lines up cleanly at first, and then a call comes in. Not from a witness, but from a roommate, saying the man he lives with has been acting strange since the murders hit the news. Pacing, barely sleeping, packing a bag like someone preparing to disappear. His name, the roommate says, is Jacob. Detectives cross-reference the name against the burner phone's carrier data, and the signal is moving, not sitting dormant, but active, pinging towers in a slow line heading south, Illinois into Indiana into Kentucky, deeper still. Whoever's carrying that phone is running. U.S. Marshals pick up the trail, and what they're following isn't just a signal anymore. It's a person coming apart in real time. Somewhere in Georgia, in the middle of the night, he calls 911 on himself. Not to report a crime. To report that he's being followed, that there are unmarked cars behind him on the highway, that he can't shake them no matter how many exits he takes. There's no record of any surveillance operation on that stretch of road. Whatever he's seeing isn't coming from outside the car. His name was Jacob Nodars. At 23, he wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a severely depressed, isolated young man who had spent years absorbing loss with almost nothing underneath him to catch it, which made him exactly the kind of person a patient manipulator could break. A childhood spent under rules so strict there was barely room to be himself. A private depression he never got real treatment for. Friends who died within months of each other. A girlfriend's betrayal by someone he'd trusted completely. A slow drift through jobs and years that would have worn down someone with far more support than he had. Nothing in his history had ever flagged him as dangerous, because nothing in his history had prepared anyone for this. Marshals find him asleep in his car outside his parents' home in Florida, the same home he'd apparently been driving toward the entire time. He doesn't resist. In the interrogation room, something shifts immediately. This isn't composed denial. He's unraveling, and what comes out isn't defiance. It's fear, specific and raw. He says that if he says the wrong thing, something terrible will happen. Not to him, to his family. And, for a long moment, he can't get past that fear long enough to say anything else. Investigators would later find a letter Jacob had written to his family in the days before the murders, one he never intended anyone but them to read. In it, he tried to explain what he believed was happening to him, that through no fault of his own, he'd been pulled into something that wanted him and everyone he loved harmed, and that going to the police wasn't an option, because the people he feared had police of their own working for them. It wasn't a confession. It was a young man saying goodbye, convinced that the only way to save his family was to do something he could never take back. Whatever happened inside that house, it's clear now he didn't walk in as a stranger acting alone. Somewhere behind him is another voice, one that convinced him the only way to protect the people he loved was to destroy someone else's family first. Johnny Borisov met Jacob Nodars the way most of their dealings began. Through drugs Borisov sold and Nodars bought. It should have stayed that simple. Instead, Borisov noticed the things about him that made him useful. The isolation, the desperation to belong to something. And, slowly, over months, he began building a story that had nothing to do with reality. He told Nodars he wasn't just a dealer, he was part of something larger, an organization with reach and resources and a willingness to act when it served them. He gave it names. A right-hand man, a man who handled distribution, a rival crew leader of equal standing, an older figure with authority above them both. He introduced Nodars to real people and told him they were members. He pointed at strangers across crowded bars and called them soldiers. None of it was real. Not the rank, not the reach, not a single one of the men whose names Nodars learned to fear. But belief doesn't need evidence. It needs repetition, and Borisov had months to spare. The lie tightened further in the weeks that followed. Borisov told Nodars he had an informant watching his old apartment, someone who reported back that Michael Kramer, the same friend Nodars had lost over this exact secret, was now planning to have him hurt before he could testify against him in the custody case. There was no informant. There was no plot. But Nodars believed it enough that one night in late February, certain Michael had already set something in motion. He sat alone in his darkened kitchen through the night, waiting for a threat that was never coming, because the only danger in his life was the man feeding him the story. Once the fear was in place, Borisov gave it a direction. Angela, he said, was threatening to expose the organization to leverage the custody battle. She knew too much. So did the rest of her family. Others would be dealt with that same night too, he claimed, part of a coordinated effort tying up loose ends across the city, which conveniently explained why he needed to be somewhere else entirely, on camera, with an alibi already built and waiting. Then he made it personal enough that hesitation stopped being an option. He produced a photo of Nodars's sister, said it had been passed around, said one of his associates had taken an interest in her, a detail he chose with precision, because he knew exactly what she had already been through. It wasn't a vague threat anymore. It was a countdown. At Borisov's urging, Nodars acquired a firearm for what he believed was his own protection. Days later, he quit his job the same afternoon, telling co-workers without explaining further that people were trying to hurt him. 1 week before the murders, Borisov drove him to the actual house. Not a description this time. The real address, the real windows. He walked him through the layout from the backyard, told him exactly where each family member would be, which way in, which way out. He told him how to avoid leaving any trace behind. It wasn't rage anymore. It was a plan, assembled with the same patience someone might use for something ordinary, except every detail in it pointed at 3 people who had no idea what was being arranged around them. For weeks, the calls between them never stopped. Investigators would later count them. Over 170 calls in each direction across just 5 weeks, sometimes more than one a day, never letting the fear settle, because Borisov was always there to reinforce it. Then, in the final 2 days before the murders, the calls simply stopped. No warning. Just silence, engineered and absolute, leaving an already terrified young man more alone than he had ever felt in his life. Exactly the state he needed to be in. Afterward, in a holding cell he didn't know was being recorded, Borisov leaned toward Nodars and asked, almost casually, whether he'd been careful. Asked what had happened to certain items afterward. He had no idea investigators had already recovered what they needed, discarded hundreds of miles away, or that every word between them was being captured, evidence that would eventually help convict him. Sitting across from investigators, describing a fear that had governed nearly every decision he'd made for months, Jacob Nodars doesn't sound like someone hiding from consequences. He sounds like someone who believed, completely, in the moment everything happened, that he was protecting the people he loved. Not hatred, a manufactured terror, built patiently by someone who understood exactly how to turn a lonely, grieving man into a weapon, and who never once had to act himself. When the case finally reached trial 3 years later, prosecutors opened by describing, in stark terms, the instructions they said Borisov had given his friend on the night of the murders, and calling him a master manipulator who had orchestrated everything from a safe distance. The defense countered that only one person had planned any of it, and it wasn't the man on trial. It was Jacob Nodars himself, guided, they argued, by his own delusions and demons. For 4 weeks, the courtroom heard both versions tested against each other. Angela testified for more than 4 hours across 2 days, her account of the year leading up to the murders never shifting under cross-examination. Psychiatrists took the stand on both sides, one saying Nodars was mentally ill but still responsible for what he'd done, another saying he may have slipped into genuine psychosis in the weeks before the killings, hearing things, believing things no sane accounting of the world would support. The disagreement mattered because it was the last real question left in the case. Was Jacob Nodars a man who'd been lied to, or a man who could no longer tell the difference between a lie and reality? The jury would eventually decide it didn't change who was responsible for building the lie in the first place. The jury took less than 3 hours to decide. That number feels almost impossibly small set against everything that came before it: the year of documented threats, the 4 weeks of testimony, the phone records laid out call by call, the jailhouse recordings where Borisov, still believing himself untouchable, asked careful questions about what had been left behind. By the time the jury left the room, there wasn't much left to weigh. Guilty, on every count. In the hallway outside, Lori's father broke down crying. Not triumph, but the specific relief of a man who'd spent 3 years afraid this story might end differently. He would later say that his family could finally rest, that they didn't have to worry about anything anymore. Words that sounded less like victory and more like the sound of a burden finally allowed to set itself down. At sentencing, Angela stood to speak, and the room went the kind of quiet that only happens once. Her voice shook at first, then it found its footing, sentence by sentence, until she wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore, but a woman, telling the man who'd tried to take everything from her that he hadn't succeeded. "My family did not deserve this," she said. "Although nothing can bring my family back, I want to be sure that this defendant does not do this to another family." The judge did not soften what came next. "You have taken your last breath of freedom's air," he told Borisov, before handing down 3 consecutive life sentences, plus 30 more years for soliciting harm against the one person who survived. There was no defense left standing by then. He had built an entire fictional world to convince someone else to act for him, and in the end, that same fabricated world became the evidence that convicted him. 2 years later, an appeals court would review the case a final time, agree the trial hadn't been perfect, and uphold the conviction anyway, because even setting its flaws aside, the evidence against him had simply been too complete to overturn. Jacob Nodars's sentencing came separately, 75 years, acknowledging both the severity of what he'd done and the cooperation that helped convict the man who put him there. "When you shattered that glass," the judge told him, "you shattered that family. You destroyed and altered those lives forever." When it came his turn to speak, Nodars turned to Angela, and what came out wasn't a defense. It was an apology reaching for words that were never going to be enough, and failing, and continuing anyway, because trying was the only thing left available to him. "I hope you will be reunited with your loved ones," he told her in a voice with nothing left to protect. "There are no words for how sorry I am for what I've done to you. The story hasn't fully closed since. Borisov's mother still argues, publicly, that her son is innocent, and in the years since his sentencing, his health has failed badly enough: kidney disease, heart failure, a body giving out inside a prison system that was never built to care for it, that she has fought, unsuccessfully so far, for his early release on medical grounds. Petitions have been filed and denied. Appeals for compassion have gone unanswered by the people who would have to grant them. It is a fight that has changed nothing about the verdict, but has kept his name, and hers, attached to a case the rest of the world moved on from years ago. For the family that lost the most that night, something else has happened, slowly, without any single turning point. The house is still there. It's still, in the most literal sense, the place where everything happened. But it isn't only that anymore, not to the people who loved the family that once filled it. Upstairs, in a bedroom that still exists exactly where it always did, there's a closet door. It doesn't hide anyone anymore. It's just a door now, in a house in a quiet town 25 miles outside Chicago, the same kind of ordinary door in the same kind of ordinary town where, for one night, nothing was ordinary at all.